like to greatly thank you all for attending again and your interest in some of the discussions that we'll be having tonight with some amazing panels that we will be introducing as well. And I'd like to briefly thank the organizers of today as well, which include members from both the BE Initiative and York Region's Youth Food Committee, who've acknowledged the holistic importance of such intersections and the need to amplify the voices and experiences of those who speak to such knowledge and intersections. So I'd like to thank you all for fostering such a collaborative environment to do this. So thank you again. You can go to the next slide. So this slide is just a list of the community guidelines for the event, and Zoom logistics are managed by Morgan and Gurneet. So in case you have any technical difficulties or questions in general, please do DM them in the chat. We do ask that you all do stay muted as the speakers share their stories. But again, we do also encourage you to use the chat feature to engage with any questions that you may have, as we will have a Q&A period near the end. But yeah, go to the next. So in regards to agenda, this is just a brief overview of the event and how we'll be spending the next little while with each other. Yeah. Go to the next. So considering that our organizers come from different parts of what is currently known as Canada, having a line acknowledgement from some of the members of this event was something that we thought was very crucial and essential. I will go myself first, but these line acknowledgements from our organizers will also be pasted in the chat for you all to read. But I will go first. Hello, my name is Nardos. I go by she, her pronouns. And in what is currently known as Scarborough, Ontario, I am a person of Eritrean East African descent, born, raised, and living on unceded traditional territory of nations including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and also home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. I acknowledge that Treaty 13 is a treaty covered by what is currently known as Toronto with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. As a second-generation immigrant myself, I acknowledge that I am a settler on traditional land in which I am grateful to work, live, and gather. As a treaty person, I acknowledge the direct colonial and intergenerational violence onto Indigenous food systems and ways of life, and thus we are grateful to gather in a space that seeks decolonization and reconciliation today. I hope that you see in the chat as well our land acknowledgements from our members of this organized event as well. So thank you for that. We can go to the next. We'll start introducing some of our event organizers for tonight. I'm also representing BE Initiative. So starting in 2019, the Black Environmental Initiative is a Make Way project dedicated to the involvement of Black and racialized communities in environmental action. We invest in environmental education for all people, particularly for and by racialized people. We fight against racism, promote diversity, and finally, we advocate for more green jobs and green investments that benefit Black, Brown, and racialized communities. So the BE Initiative has some volunteers that has helped and supported the organization for tonight, including Konya Bangura, Research Lead, Samantha Santoro, Research and Communications Lead, Nardos Tedros, myself, who's the Black Communities Outreach Lead, Xavier Amodio, Francophone Lead at BE Initiative. I'll pass it on to Sophia, a volunteer with York Region's Youth Food Committee, to introduce yourself and the organization.
Thanks so much, Nardos. So yeah, hello everyone. My name is Sophia. I am a committee member of the York Region Youth Food Committee. And this committee is a working group of the York Region Food Council and is an arm of the York Region Food Network, co-founded in 2021 by Gurneet and Morgan, who are co-founders at, co-workers at the York Region Food Network. The Youth Food Committee offers a platform for youth to connect with one another and insert their voices in food system issues. Through the Youth Food Committee, youth pursue topics, projects, and events that catch their interest, and with the support from the York Region Food Network. So the Youth Food Committee volunteers who helped plan this event are, as I mentioned, Morgan and Gurneet, co-founders, as well as myself, committee member. Next slide, please. And of course, lastly, we'd like to thank the Innovation York at York University for sponsoring this event and supporting us in coordinating the panel tonight. Next slide, please.
So as mentioned, this event is a collaboration between the Black Environmental Initiative and the York Region Youth Food Committee, focused on exploring the intersections of food insecurity and environmental racism in what is currently known as Canada. And we overall to just have and foster a conversational and anti-oppressive space online tonight. Move to the next. So we'll go over some important terms at this time to just familiarize the audience with some common terminology that will be used throughout the panel. And you can also check the chat and the links below just to check where we obtained these definitions as well. So environmental racism is a form of systemic racism as a result of institutional policies and practices rather than individual beliefs and actions. In 1982, Benjamin Chavis, a Black civil rights leader from the United States, coined and defined the concept as racial discrimination in environmental policymaking, the enforcement of regulations and laws, the deliberative targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, the official sanctioning of the life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in our communities, and the history of excluding people of color from leadership of the ecology movement. Environmental justice goes on to discuss a grassroots response to environmental racism, valuing respect, the health of our communities and the earth, and protection from discrimination, dispossession, and exploitation, and etc. Food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Food insecurity is the inability to acquire or consume an adequate diet, quality, or sufficient quantity of food in socially acceptable ways, or the uncertainty that one will be able to do so. Food justice seeks to ensure that benefits and risks of where, what, and how food is grown, produced, transported, distributed, accessed, and eaten are shared fairly. Food justice represents a transformation of the current food system, including but not limited to eliminating disparities and inequities. Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to a healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural system. Thank you. Next. So we'll begin introducing some of our speakers for tonight, and I'll start with myself as your moderator for tonight as well. Hello again, my name is Nardos Tedros. My pronouns are she and her, and I recently completed my undergrad at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly known as Ryerson, and I am originally from what is currently known as Scarborough, Ontario. I am currently a Black Communities Outreach Lead at BE Initiative, and I've always been passionate about social justice initiatives, community outreach, and political advocacy within and outside of government to support BIPOC communities in the GCA, but also provincially, nationally, and hopefully internationally. I'll pass it on to Samantha and Sophia to introduce some of our other speakers for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nardos. I'm Samantha. I am a volunteer of the Black Environmental Initiative. I'm a research communications lead there. And at York Region's Youth Food Committee, I am a committee member as well, Sophia. I'm introducing some of the panelists this evening, one of which is Jean-Philippe Vezina, who's a market gardener and a social entrepreneur. Being himself of Haitian origin, he was inspired by the traditions and arrangements of the Creole garden, Jardin Lacou, to develop his eco-friendly farm located in what is currently known as Dunham, Quebec. The Jardin Lacou project represents for its owner much more than an opportunity to grow vegetables. This is the business endeavor he chose to bring together in the same organization, his managerial experiences, vision for a sustainable world, and his need to reconnect with his Haitian and African roots. Thank you so much, Jean-Philippe. Next slide. Dr. Amy Shawanda is Anishinaabe from Wikwemikong, Manitoulin Island. She is the Provost Postdoctoral Fellow at the Donnelly School of Public Health. Hansel Igboboa is a multidisciplinary artist, filmmaker, community organizer, and researcher. His work is steeped in storytelling, community building, activism, and social innovation. Many of his works explore the liberative and transformative power of food and reconnection to Indigenous knowledge and traditions. He currently works at FoodShare as the Right to Food campaign coordinator, a community researcher and steering committee member at the Black Youth Farming Collective, and formerly a research assistant at the Center for Studies in Food Security at what is now known as TMU. And then Sylvia Serapua is an interdisciplinary academic with expertise in sustainable agri-food systems, a professor in the School of Environment Design and Rural Development in the University of Guelph. She has more than 20 years of proven experience in the fields of intersectional and gender planning, participatory plant breeding, and farmer-led research in agri-food systems. Her undergraduate studies in agronomy were concluded in the Universidad Nacional del Centro del Peru. She completed her MSc study and PhD studies with the University of Guelph, Canada, and she also has had a postdoctoral fellowship with the World Fish Center, CGIAR, in Malaysia. And I'll pass it over to Sophia.
Thanks. So next we have Anand Zola Laloli, who is a food sovereignty and food justice advocate, musician, and vegan of 44 years. Anand is one of the founders and executive director of the African Food Basket, a nonprofit food justice and food sovereignty organization that began in 1995 in Toronto. Anand has a master's degree in environmental studies from York University with a focus on community food security and a diploma in business administration from Centennial College. Anand is presently a research associate fellow at Toronto Metropolitan University and chair of the Black Food Sovereignty Working Group. Edwo Toku is the Seniors Gardening Program Facilitator at Black Creek Community Farm. She is passionate about regenerative urban agriculture, wellness through food, and community care. Learning and sharing knowledge is important to her, and these days she gets excited about mycelial plant relations. And last but not least, we have Nicole Austin, who is an ardent food justice and food security advocate, environmentalist, and geographer who strongly believes nutrition and food are central to individual and community well-being and act as the foundation upon which marginalized peoples are able to build capacity to become food sovereign on their own terms. Nicole holds a degree in geography and environmental science from the University of Guelph and recently earned a Bachelor's of Applied Science in Nutrition and Food from Toronto Metropolitan University. She is currently working as the Black Food Sovereignty Engagement Coordinator at the Urban Farm and is part of the strategic planning team with Toronto's Black Food Sovereignty Alliance.
And at that, we'd like to thank you all again for attending and to all the panelists who are here today to share their knowledges and expertise in environmental justice, racism, and food insecurity, food justice, food sovereignty, and beyond as well. So thank you all for attending as well. And thank you both, Sophia and Samantha, for that as well. But it is finally time to dive into some questions and begin the discussion in which we have some questions for our panelists. So our first question, which is the general question for this section, also seeks to just get a better understanding of the essentiality of the work that they do and how these intersections exist. So the general question is, how would you describe the intersection of food and environmental justice in your professional, personal, and/or geographic settings? To begin with you, Hansel, and considering the amazing work that you're currently doing at the Black Youth Farming Collective, how would you say food justice, food sovereignty, or environmental justice manifests in your work in supporting food leadership, community capacity building, and employment training for Black youth?
Yeah, thank you, Nardos, for the question. Again, my name is Hansel Igbawa. I'm a pronouncer he, him. When it comes to that question, I think specifically with the work at BYFC, what we do is there's, I guess, the one end of like giving Black youth opportunities to develop like what we call leadership skills. So whether it be having the opportunity to speak to political figures who make impact within the city, or food justice advocates, or like folks who advocate for food sovereignty like Anand and do research. So there's that aspect, and then there's also the aspect where youth have the opportunity to connect, to learn growing skills. But I think most importantly, the work at the BYFC is really a healing work. And what I mean by that is like, it gives Black youth and myself and many other people the opportunity to reconnect back to land and be a part of nature in a way that's more tangible and meaningful, that many of us do not have that opportunity to do, especially growing up in an urban area. Like when you grow up in an urban area, especially in the GTA, like, you're in a concrete jungle, there's barely access to green spaces. So folks don't even barely even know like where certain foods come from, like what foods look like, or that carrots grow in the ground. So there's many barriers to accessing our environment or accessing nature and being a part of nature. And the project really provides that for youth, because I know like even while we're going through the program, like a lot of people came in being like, oh, I don't do bogs, or a lot of people didn't want to take their shoes off when we're doing like meditation. Like they're like, I don't put my feet on the ground. You know, it's strange for people to put their feet on the actual ground. And there's just many other things that showed that huge disconnect to land, and disconnect to nature. And folks going through that program, youth going through that program, and you see them on the other side of the other end of the program, like after many months of coming out on the farm, and their perspective and their relationship to their environment is completely different. One, they're proud of like what they've created. They're proud of like what they can do with their hands, and like what work and the commitment they put in and the results it gives. And they're also a lot more open to, you know, working without gloves, for example, or just like taking their shoes off. So I think that's an important part of the work we do. And there is starting to be more opportunities similar to the BYFC that are, you know, coming up around the GTA. But honestly, there's not that many opportunities, especially for Black youth, because yeah, there could be programs that may have existed in the past. And also I should also acknowledge that, you know, there's been very fundamental programs that have existed in the past, like people like Anon and Solomon Boy have created in the past for Black youth. And those youth who went through that program are the ones who are leading the field and the space today. They're the ones making changes and making impact. And it would be amazing for us to have more programs like this for Black youth to go through. So yeah, I think I would leave it as that, and also say that for youth to not, especially Black youth, to not have access to programs like that, and to not have access to the natural environment, to nature, is, you know, a conversation of like, also a conversation of environmental racism, because we don't get to connect in the same way. And there's a whole list of ways that affects, you know, people mental health or physical health, you know, even job opportunities. There's just many, economically, there's just many ways that, you know, that trickles down and that impacts people's lives.
Thank you so much. I definitely do agree. The barrier that exists is so much in that food systems are not open enough, or like they don't exist, that are accessible, and there's not enough empowering education, especially for Black youth, to get connected to the land and so much more. And even though it's so exciting to see these opportunities growing, there is absolutely an essentiality for more of these opportunities. And I think the advocacy that you all are doing is absolutely amazing in doing this as well. So thank you for that. I'd like to pass it on to Amy, with the same question. How would you say these manifest, or when I say these, food justice, food sovereignty, or environmental justice manifest in your work on Indigenous peoples' traditional and local food systems?
I don't know if you want to take Nicole's questions really quickly, or.
Nardos, I'm sorry, I did put my hand up only because when we got oriented, I heard that it was, you would hope it would be a little bit of a conversation, and I can't wait to hear what Amy says. But Hansel always inspires me. He's so smart and wise. So I'll just take a moment to pick up on a couple of the things that he said. So, you know, to me, the amazing work that Black youth are doing in these food justice and food insecurity spaces, food sovereignty spaces, environmental justice spaces, you know, it's so important to manifest in food leadership, community capacity building, and even employment training. And so I just wanted to take a moment to say that although there are so many, you know, parts and pieces that we're all trying to bring together, I think, as Hansel said, it's the foundation from our elders, which goes back to our ancestors, which is both direct and actually living example of how this work manifests to make real change, true, food sovereignty, transformation. And I think the connection that I really love that Hansel hit on is the generation to generation, because it lays the foundation for what we will imagine in this time, what Black food sovereignty can be. And I just wanted to really just, touch on that and celebrate that. It's so important because, Hansel, myself, so many of us wouldn't have this knowledge or confidence or capacity to build this without our elders and ancestors. And I'm so happy someone like Anand is here with us, as he always is, tirelessly always is. So thank you for that time. Thank you, Amy.
You're welcome, Nicole. Yeah, so just looking back at the questions, I think looking from an individual perspective, how food systems looking at from an Indigenous perspective, I think it's very individual, and meaning like when I first started my journey learning about Indigenous foods, I mean, it was always introduced, but I never really thought or processed it in the whole dynamic in the way that we are actually fortunate that we can go on our land in our First Nation and go forage, or we can collect and we can learn about the certain foods that are in there. But when I got pregnant with my older son, I was thinking about how he was not exposed to any of that food until it was my second and my third child, where I was like, all that food, all that nutrition that they're getting actually starts in pregnancy. And so I really need to look at that and start introducing these foods. So I started eating wild rice and I started eating the traditional foods. I tried my best to eat seasonally based on my cravings, of course. But it was looking at this journey with food. And then there is an elder, Edna Menetwabi, that I worked with on my dissertation, and she talked about that the first treaty is between mother and child when you have that breast milk. I was like, okay, well, what happens when you can't breastfeed and you have to turn to formula? Because I wasn't able to breastfeed with my oldest. And so what is that relation? And she just said, well, you're still creating that treaty because they're being fed. Like, it doesn't matter the means of they're being fed, they're being fed. So I was like, okay, I guess that's a different way to look at it. As much as we try to encourage breastfeeding, it's not always possible. But also really taking a look at what I was eating. I had to make sure like everything I was consuming was good and nutritious for me and my child. And looking at that, and I felt like it was a journey with each child that I was getting more independent and looking at the food that we were eating. In our home, we're situated in an urban area, so I have a little bit more accessibility than say if I were living on a First Nation outside and a little bit more isolated. And so looking at how that manifests and kind of looking at it professionally, I taught the Indigenous Food Systems Environmental and Health course at U of T, and looking at that, I had brought in a few guest speakers because I was like, I know there's a wealth of knowledge out there, and I'm only one person. And I feel like I had brought someone in that talked about seeds, and I backed it up with podcasts and readings that they can learn about generational seeds, matriarch seeds, and learning about the different types of seeds, and especially with the different types of corn that we have in our communities and what that looks like, and learning about this community through trade and learning through really sharing our knowledge and stories and gifts and these seeds. So it was such an inspiration, like that first class just based on seed, because he talked about generational seeds. It was handed down from generation to generation. And then those same seeds are feeding our future generations because we keep harvesting and we keep pulling those in. And then I brought another local speaker from Alderville First Nation, and she talked about the various gardening. There's not just one way of gardening, and she was bringing in all these techniques and things she's tried and that's failed. And she did her own research and how she was doing all of this beautiful work and the different, like something I want to try because I am situated in an urban area is hay bale gardening, and because they compost, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. Why didn't I research that? And then I brought in another person, Sophie Pheasant, and she was talking about harvesting health. And I was just like, what? And her presentation was just so beautiful she was looking at the quadrants of the medicine wheel and like looking at how you feed yourself seasonally and what is one you will try each season to really try make recipes with. And so I did myself personally after her lecture, I said, I'm going to try wild rice. And I started on this historical journey of Minomen, which translates into the good berry, and looking at how Minomen is such a resilient grain. It's both in Canada and the US, and it's both used by Anishinaabe and other nations. And looking at how this very resilient grain, it's also like a weed, I guess by a Western view of it. But even the tensions here in Mississauga territory, which is the Mississaugas. And I don't know if anyone's ever watched Cottagers and Indians. It's a play, and they talk about the tensions where the Cottagers want to wipe out this Minomen. They don't want it in the lake, and it's a traditional food right of the Mississaugas and the Anishinaabe peoples. And so they went through this battle, and it's still ongoing. There's still a lot of tension that is happening here in this territory. So I thought it was such an interesting take, because until I moved here, I was really exposed to all of these tensions that were going on. I always knew about Minomen being in our communities and part of our culture. However, I also do really want to quickly touch upon our geographical as First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. But if you look at coast to coast to coast, that our food systems are all very greatly, vastly different in how we harvest and how we collect. And we used to migrate with the seasons, the herds, even the food. Like if there was a drought happening, our boundaries would often shift, but now we're just segregated into these little patches of land, and we're not allowed to leave. Way back when, until the 1960s, until the pass system was finally lifted, that we were able to finally get off the reserve. And I think it was actually a little bit sooner than that, but we were able to leave and get food. And one of the biggest things that is happening is like these food insecurities within our community, especially during the pandemic. A lot of our communities were fed the 5 white lies, like sugar, flour, salt, and dairy. And I was looking at these food hampers that were coming in our communities. I was like, if I caught COVID, how am I supposed to heal myself with all of this garbage? And I know it's survival food. I know at the end of the day, it's survival food. It's still food that we can consume. But I was like, there has to be a better way for our communities to be fed what's in these hampers, because there was not much for fresh veggies and food. And it was really interesting because someone had taken, they were also given Spam in a can, like Spam, and that was part of the hamper. And so I'm not trying to talk bad about communities at all. It's just to bring this into the conversation, that they thought that this was part of the food, and someone had threw them in the garbage, and people were very upset. And I was like, but that's okay. That's kind of where it belongs. It's like, just leave it there. But people are upset because they were talking about, well, we can eat that. And I understood from a poverty point of view that, yeah, that other people, this is survival food for them, but it's not necessarily good for all of us to be consuming that on a daily basis, because that's how we get into, it really affects our health. It just increases all of those diabetes and everything else that's happening. And we're in the system, and yet these health systems are not good for us. So we're in this really weird cycle of like, we need to better educate our communities on returning back to the land. And so one of the arguments often we hear in our communities is like, usually when we talk about reclaiming, reclamation, is that people say, well, why don't you guys just go live back in teepees and things like that or whatever? And it's really interesting. It's like, well, we really can't, because we actually adapted to a lot of things. Like anything that would happen, we often adapt, and we weren't always just static and stuck in the past. We adapted and moved on. And so we actually embrace technology. And so when we're here, we have and I shared this with my class, we have these issues and we embrace these technologies that brought in, but we can't actually go back because the land is polluted, our animals are hurting, we can't grow the crops that we want to. And when you think of monocultures, like those are being affected as well. So when I had this conversation, I can't necessarily go back, and sometimes we need these technologies to help continue our trajectory of healing with the land, because I think we're all in this space where we want to reclaim our traditional practices, whichever they may be in our respective territories. So I just want to say thank you. That's all I want to share right now.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much, Amy, for sharing that. And thank you so much for sharing about your family and your stories and how it's manifested into your independence and agency as a mother as well. And thank you for talking about connecting with your community and how powerful and empowering it is to further education and reclaim that power back into the communities as well, especially in talks of the pandemic and how it's affected BIPOC communities across the globe at this point. And considering compromised health, these are really important discussions to have in terms of relocating that power back into communities. So thank you for that. We'll pass it on to Jean-Philippe for now as well. With the same question, but how do these manifest in your work with Les Jardins Laco, helping Afro-descendants in Quebec reconnect with their culinary and agricultural traditions through ecological agriculture?
Sorry. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me for this panel. So yeah, I will share a bit about my journey of how I got to start this project called Les Jardins Laco. I'm going to go a bit quick, but I'm going to make the link with how it links with food justice and food sovereignty for BIPOC people. So, farming is a pretty new project for me. It's my third year farming. So before that, I was working I've been working for many years in the community sector in the Montreal area, specifically working in community organization in different Black communities of Montreal. For those who know Montreal, I worked in the Côte-des-Neiges area, Saint-Michel, Rivière-des-Prairies, Pointe-aux-Trembles, which are very diverse community neighborhoods of Montreal with people coming from a lot of different backgrounds. I worked a lot in the Black community, and as a community worker, as a nonprofit manager, I had the opportunity to realize how food particularly impact people in their capacity to live healthy and to fully integrate their community, especially when there are families of new immigrants. Often when people they come from either the Caribbean, come from Africa or any other countries as an immigrant, they often come very healthy, and as they acclimate to the North American diet, often their health start declining because they are losing their food habit, what they are used to cook with, what they are used to eat. So in the end, what happens is that they go to the easy way. They go to junk food. They go to very processed food. Often because of lack of information, lack of opportunity to access food that they know that they are fresh. Sometimes we can find those food, but they're not as fresh as what they are used to eat back in their own countries, especially people coming from the Caribbean, coming from Africa, Latin America. We are used to buy our food almost daily. We go to the market, we eat it fresh, it tastes good, it's full of flavor. And with what we get in our grocery stores here are food that are obviously picked up where they're not yet ripped, and they travel thousands of miles before coming to our grocery stores, and they don't taste that good. So even if people want to stick to their culinary tradition, they sometimes are not completely satisfied. So, and there's a lot of peer pressure from the outside world to adopt what we call North American diet. So one of the reasons when I decided to start this farm project, because at the beginning, I just wanted to farm, grow vegetable. But personally, I was born in Haiti, but I grew up in Montreal, Canada. And throughout my adult journey, it was always important to find a way to stay connected with my Haitian roots and my African roots. So I just, while doing my research, I had the opportunity to learn about a project in the United States called Soulfire Farm. And I had the opportunity to meet with one of the co-founders called Leah Pennyman. She's also the author of a book called Farming While Black, which I recommend to everyone. Really interesting book. And this is how I really started to see how I could use farming as a way not only to offer fresh and fresh food, but also culturally appropriated food for people, especially people of African descent, that they can feel connected with. And also, it was a good way to tackle some of the issues related around health, because people in the Black communities, especially, I will speak for people of African descent, we are way more prone to chronic disease like diabetes, strokes, obesity than the general population in Canada. And that is linked to social economic factor, but it's also about the choice we make in our food diets. So this is something I really wanted to be able to help people with through education. That's where I took some of my background from my previous work in my farming business to bring that into the mix. So really what I'm offering to people through Jardin Lacou is an opportunity to eat healthy, to eat food that is flavorful, and to really bring back in the conversation all the heritage of people of African descent, especially in the history of the Americas. We've been here for many, many years, and because of the context of how people of African descent were brought in the New World, often our contribution in terms of agricultural knowledge, in terms of food that we brought from Africa, food that we adopted here in the new continent by our contact with the First Nation, but also with the European colonizer, we developed new flavor, new ways of cooking. A lot of people got influenced by that. And I think it's important that we bring back that conversation in the general knowledge of the population. So it's a really important aspect of what I do with Jardin Lacou, especially in terms of the educational aspect. So every time people receive their basket, they receive a list of what they're gonna receive in their weekly baskets, but also a little capsule about history, about how that food is connected to our history as African people of African descent, and how often it's connected also with our contact with First Nation people. And just to make a quick note about the name of my farm. The name of my farm is called Jardin Lacou. It's coming from Haitian Creole, and in Creole, we say Jardin Lacou, which is the backyard garden. It's a concept that is really present in a lot of the islands in the Caribbean, but especially in Haiti, it's definitely linked with when the country got its independence and fought its war against France for its independence. A lot of the new free Africans were on the island for not that many long ago. So they were still really connected with their African roots, and they wanted to, as much as possible, get away from the plantation model. So they developed that model of community living, community gardening, where we call it the Lacou, where it's a gathering of houses of extended family members, and they cultivate together a plot of land where they try to be as much as possible self-sustainable, where they cultivate fruits, vegetables, medicine, different varieties of trees that they use for building materials, for making music instruments, to making daily objects that they need. And when I did a trip to Haiti back in 2017, I went to meet one of my good friends, and I used to be a coworker back here in Montreal. She decided to move in Haiti and start a Jardin Lacou over there, where she do some educational training, working with people in the countryside, as well as doing some tree planting and reforestation projects. And was really inspiring for me to visit her. So I wanted to bring a bit of that experience back in Quebec. And it was at the same time when I had this idea of maybe changing a career and starting farming. So that trip to Haiti, that visit of the farm, Soulfire Farm in the New York State, and my encounter with Léa Piniman, those two events really shaped the form of what is Jardin Lacou today. And so what I do now, I do educational program, I do food basket, the CSA program, so community supported agriculture, where I offer different varieties of food that we find either in African diets, Caribbean diets, diets from Brazil, the southern state of the United States, and some more traditional food that we find here, staples that we find here in Quebec. And I do an educational workshop, especially during the winter time. During Black History Month, I will talk a lot about the history of Black culture, especially related to agriculture and food. And so that's my contribution to that, to food security, because I work a lot with the nonprofit organization by offering some of the baskets, and also with the educational aspect. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jean-Philippe. I really enjoyed how you acknowledged the understanding the right to a healthy environment. And thank you for also providing the perspective of the Black migrant experiences as well, especially in accessibility to culturally appropriative foods that connects Black diasporas to their culture, especially when acclimating to the North American diet, as you mentioned. And these historical and colonial contexts are so essential for this discourse on Black food sovereignty as well. So thank you for that. We'll move on to Sylvia. Considering these as well, can you talk about how these manifest in your work at the intersection of rural planning and food security?
Good evening, everybody. First, I would like to thank you for this initiative. It is great to be surrounded by young advocates for food security, food justice, and food sovereignty. Well, first, let me say something about myself that it was not presented in the introduction. I am from Peru. I come from a rural area in the central Andes of Peru. My town is located at 3,270 meters above sea level. And I grew up within a context that we have continuous engagement with indigenous communities, representing Quechua and Aymara communities, small-scale farmers, family farmers, and people dedicated to commercialize the products and the agrobiodiversity that is produced in these communities. And because of that, my interest was to study agronomy in order to work in the field with the farmers. But after I realized that it was too technical, and when I came to Canada, I immigrated to Canada with my family and my children. I decided to study capacity development and extension because I aim to continue working with indigenous communities in Latin America and Canada at that time. Because I said it is not only about agronomy, but it is the integration of scientific and technical knowledge with indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. And because of that, I wanted to learn more about how to work with diverse groups. And since then, doing my PhD, I integrated also local innovation systems to my studies. And I had a privilege to work in different parts of the world through different assignments with the Dutch government and also with a umbrella for research in development around the world. It is called Worldfish Center. And from that experience, I learned to work with indigenous communities, with youth, and intersecting different social dimensions to gender, because I extensively work in gender planning and gender transformative approach. And with that experience, I came back to University of Guelph as a professor. I am teaching in the international stream of rural planning and development. And what I do is to teach, to do research, and to do service, because these are the three components that I am asked to fulfill while I am a faculty in the University of Guelph. What I do is thinking about international work with vulnerable and indigenous communities around the world. I teach courses related to international rural planning and development, where students learn about the different theories of rural development, the formal mainstreaming theories, but also we learn about alternative approaches to development, how to work with indigenous communities, with BIPOC communities around the world and in Canada. And then we have another course in gender planning and social planning. And these are integrated very nicely with the different courses that are taught, not only in my program, the Rural Planning and Development Program, but also in the other programs that are part of the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development. But what I aim from these courses is my students to be aware of social differences, social inequalities. And I use different theories that, well, some of you may be familiar. I use intersectionality, social inclusion, but I also focus on learning. And the focus of my teaching and research is built in three learning loops. One is that my students learn for practice, for action, and then they go to the field and apply what they learn. And it is the beauty of my program, because my program is applied, is more professional, it integrates theory with practice, and students have the benefit of, for example, being working as researchers, scientists, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary scientists, but also, and more importantly, to work as practitioners and planners. It means that we are connectors, we are enablers, and we integrate social aspects, cultural aspects to scientific knowledge. I have students that are working in, for example, with Maasai women in Tanzania and Kenya. I have other students who are working in Peru with indigenous communities and documenting resilient seed systems of potato, maize, because as you may be aware, for example, in Peru, we have around 8,000 varieties of native potatoes, different colors, different shapes, different textures. We also have maize, as we have in Canada. We have different land races and local varieties, populations that need to be studied, but also we look for integration of social, cultural, and scientific aspects. I also do service, and I am proud of being part of a growing culture, an organization that is growing in the United States, around the world. Some of you are familiar. Growing Culture is an advocacy group that is implementing different actions in relation to food sovereignty, food justice, and food security around the world. They are working with different groups representing BIPOC populations in USA and also around the world. And for that work, we integrate, and in my research, we integrate with different farmer-led organizations. We organize conversations in university. We are introducing farmers to university and valuing intercultural conversations. We use in our work and in all the courses that I teach, intersectionality and social inclusion are key aspects, but also participatory and collaborative planning tools. So our students are well prepared at Canadian and international level in order to work with multicultural teams, in order to integrate teams, but also to exercise power in a different way, in a power that it is not cohesive and it is top-down. It is power that it is shared, power that it is with or to people for empowerment of people, for power within. And for a reason, we have been able to implement some apply projects in Tanzania, in Kenya, in Mozambique, in Peru, in Guatemala, with indigenous groups, and Colombia. For me, for a reason, I say these type of events are empowering because it shows your interest and also your commitment in order to help things change and transform. And it is important for young people, for university students to know and recognize how transformation can happen in order to have more sustainable agri-food systems that are inclusive, that are representative. And when I say representative, representation is not the same as participation. We want food systems that include people who represent women in countries where women don't have a voice, don't exercise their voice, where women don't have land. We also want indigenous or BIPOC representatives and participating in the decision-making of laws, policies, and representing the communities in order to secure food and have justice in relation to environmental protection and degradation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. You touched on a lot of amazing points, emphasizing Indigenous knowledge internationally, especially in correspondence to your Peruvian roots as well, and emphasizing different ways of life and living, and especially in terms of what you teach, and carrying out hands-on learning approaches, which you mentioned as well is youth empowering as well. So thank you so much for that. I'm gonna hand on to Adwoa. How does food insecurity and such manifest in your work on food justice for racialized communities that are served by Black Creek Community Farm?
So my name is Adwoa. I'm super honored to be here with so many amazing thinkers and advocates in the community. And so, yeah, I think I'll start off with maybe my own personal way of coming into this work. So I studied sociology at Wilfrid Laurier University and got my undergraduate there. By the end of that time, I was focusing a lot on environmental racism, but by way through wellness. So outside of my work, I'm a studying yoga teacher. The body is like very, it's just like a big portal for all of us, right? And so this was kind of how I came into this work, was through really kind of how fat phobic our medical system is and the ways that, you know, these measures of obesity disproportionately affect Black and Brown folks, Black and Brown and Indigenous folks across North America, and the ways that this is so entirely tied with living locations and with access to food and with really just the ways that like many of our communities have been kind of pigeonholed into these very specific choices that do not work with our bodies well, and then in that same point get blamed for it and get titled as, you know, either having like poor eating habits or, you know, low rates of or high rates of heart disease and all these things that are really made to pathologize and like individualize the ways that these systemic problems have actually created what these people now are creating as statistics. And so that was kind of coming into that world is why I came into farming, and it came into growing food specifically for the idea of, you know, how can we take care of ourselves, especially when we come into these places and are in these kind of environments where like I'm thinking of Flint, Michigan, right? If people do not have clean drinking water, then how do we assess their health as anything other than, you know, not being held by these state sanctions? And so I think knowing all of this and kind of coming from this place, food and environmental justice can't be separated, right? Because we aren't separate from the land, and the food that we eat is very much grown on this land. And so if inner cities and urban areas and Black, Brown, Indigenous folks are within distance of toxic fumes, of toxic chemicals, of toxic sites, we can't then say that, you know, the food that grows from there, and many of the times food that can't be grown from there, we can't say that that then can't affect how it'll then come into our bodies and what it'll do to us once it gets in there, right? And so that's a really big bridge for me in seeing the ways that like food and environmental injustice are connected and the ways that they're also tied in our sovereignty as well. And so with Black Creek Community Farm, we come at it from, as Sylvia said, as Amy said, like a very educational side where it's kind of two parts. So specifically within the pandemic, the farm was able to create the emergency food box. And so we directly served community members in the Black Creek area, which falls into the Jane and Finch area in Toronto, Treaty 13 land. And that was something that was used for families, seniors, and folks with different abilities who actually couldn't even risk finding food and having the food that's around them not be not being nourishing in that way. And so the farm was able to sustain, and we kind of shifted a lot of our market garden growing into growing this food for the community members themselves, making sure that every week there was a box of fresh vegetables that was delivered and having it make sure that we were able to keep it on in the heyday. And I think the unfortunate thing about this work and what I hope, you know, we can shift within the future is the way that like food access is seen as a charitable effect, you know, this idea of this is something that we do because people are in trouble, when the truth is we're like all always in trouble, right? And like we all always kind of and will absolutely need help at some point in our lives or another. And so shifting it from, oh, there's a crisis, and so now we have to give food, into how can we actually just sustain and keep a part of it so that there's always food access for people, because there's always going to be material insecurity so long as we live under these systems, right? And so at the farm, we are a nonprofit and we are a smaller organization. So we have had to put a halt on our emergency food box, but we were able to keep it going for the 2 years within 2020 and 2021, and shifting with whenever we get funding, being able to give grocery cards or grocery gift cards so that people can go access and get food themselves. And so supporting people beyond, you know, the peak of crisis into the fact that people were hungry before the pandemic and people are going to be hungry as this pandemic shifts into what it will as the future goes on. So that's one side of it. But then the other side of it is the ways that we try to make access to educational and actual tangible resources very easy for people who live in the community. So Black Creek Farm, again, is located in the middle, walking distance from Jane and Finch, Jane and Shoreham, where we actually try to hold space and make sure that even though the farm is growing, there is still specific intentional purpose that is based on the people who still live within the community. And so that looks like we have our youth programs where our farm school program actually holds like field trips on site. So youth that are from the elementary schools and high schools around the area can come on the land and spend the day and do activities and also learn substantial things for them that they can then take into the future. I'm sorry if you can hear my cat. He's meowing so loud right now. But things like that. Myself personally, I work with the seniors garden. So essentially they are community garden plots that engage the seniors that live within the area to grow their own food. And on the other side of that, also cook the food as well. And so, you know, the learning doesn't just stop with having these plants in the ground. That's like only part of the learning. After that, we actually go on into like, what do we do with this food? How do we continue to eat? How do these things come together? And with our urban harvest program, they take it into like food waste reduction. And so food preservation, how to lessen food waste and do these things so that it's a full circle cycle of like, what do you do when you get the seed all the way up to what can you do once you're done eating it, you know? And so we try to support and uplift self-determination, right? Because I think, of course, there are so many levels and systems of how this work of food justice and food sovereignty must be done. And of course, we need our legislation and our mandates and our people high up doing what they're doing, but we also need to be able to do what we can with our hands, right? And I think that's like the important thing too, of like doing what we can with what we can. And so Black Creek really serves specifically with marginalized, racialized, low income folks to be able to use accessible ways to access the food that they need, especially in areas where that food might take them, 3 bus rides or a whole ton of inconveniences to just get food that also could grow in the land right beside them. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. And yeah, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Ajwa. You touched also on some amazing points as well, especially like the fundamental nature of food insecurity and environmental justice. As these oppressive systems, as you mentioned, tend to direct blame unjustly towards people. And you also touched on reimagining how we understand food insecurity. And it's amazing what the emergency food box has been doing, especially during in 2020 and such, as you mentioned. And supporting the local communities, such as the Jane and Finch community, in terms of self-determination has been amazing as well. So thank you so much. I'll pass on to Anan as well. How do these manifest in your work, in the work that you do at Toronto Metropolitan University's Center for Studies in Food Security?
Good evening, and thank you for being here. I'd like to give thanks to the Almighty for being here, my ancestors for giving me the strength coming forward to have this conversation. And I also like to thank the Black Environmental Initiative and the Youth Food Committee in York Region for putting on this fabulous conversation. I'm very honored because as communities of color, I've been on this journey for a pretty long time, and these are the focused conversations that we should have been having. I've been doing this work for like 27 years, and the first 15 years was just mostly myself and white folks. I could safely say that. And to see these conversations happening now, it's a blessing. The contributions in the past with folks who really pushed the idea about food justice. And when we talk about food justice, it's good to have a sense of where it came from, what it represents. I have a bit of history at the beginning of the movement of food justice that started in North America. And it came out of looking at injustice in the food system. So when we talk about food justice, we're talking about food justice and dismantling racism in the food system. A lot of folks would say they have a food justice garden, a food justice meal program, but really and truly is looking at anti-racism agenda within the food system, to put it in some perspective. And I know Sylvia really made a really interesting presentation, and I like to follow in that example. I am originally from the north coast of the Amazon, in what the indigenous community originally called Guyana, the land of many waters. I'm up here 40 years. Now, I know Nardos made a comment when she was speaking about Sylvia, and she said, Peru is not in the Caribbean, Peru is in South America. The great thing about Guyana that we're in the Caribbean and we're in South America at the same time. And some folks just get confused about that because we're the only English-speaking country in South America. So let me run through quickly. I am not the executive director of the African Food Basket anymore. I have retired from that position. I am now the chair of the Black Food Sovereignty Working Group. But just a little bit of quick history of the African Food Basket. They started as a food buying club, a nonprofit food buying club, consumer cooperative, delivering culturally specific food baskets to folks from the Caribbean and Africa and Latin America across Toronto originally. And then about a year after, we had a conversation called Roots to Fruits, where we had people like Winston Husband, who was a food policy person at that time, Nene Kafeli, an African-centered teacher, Yuga, a Black environmentalist, and my mentor, Solomon Boye, urban agriculturalist, work with the city community garden program. And they set the course or the direction of where the African Food Basket need to go. It was African-centered. It focused on organic urban agriculture, looking at food policy, and also looking at growing food that is ecologically safe. We started doing urban agriculture programs along with the food basket, and especially engaging young people in a program we call Cultivating Youth Leadership. Because we think it was critical, and I heard a lot of these comments tonight about living in urban areas and the access to specific areas of growing food. But just growing up in an apartment building, it's hard to really interact with growing food in a very positive way. So our program from 25 years ago was always intentional of engaging Black youths and communities of color in urban agriculture, but specifically Black youths. And I say so because in Toronto, it's a very interesting place for people of African descent. It's one of the most diverse people of African descent communities in the world. We have people from over 170 countries, people of African descent that live in Toronto, and over 240 something different ethnic groups. So when we talk about Black food sovereignty, some people tend to see it in different ways, but it's bringing all these folks together and setting an agenda of what we need to do as people of African descent. Because when we are confronted with white supremacy and Black anti-racism, they don't look to see if you're from Eritrea, look if you're from Nigeria, if you're from South Africa, if you're from Jamaica, if it's wherever you're from, along the color of your skin, Black, that is what you get. You know, as you guys realize what happened in Buffalo a couple days ago, where you had a white supremacist shot and killed 10 people of African descent. And one of the folks who was shot is a woman from Guyana, surprisingly, and it's African Americans. So it's important for us when we're talking about looking at the food system and food sovereignty, we have to get together. Like some folks have said, I not deriding BIPOC, but I know people of African descent, we have an agenda that need to be looked at together and intentionally. We talk a lot about country-specific foods. Since we started the African Food Basket, that's one of the main focus. We look at how we could grow country-specific foods in Canada. And we definitely, as the African Food Basket, we champion growing callaloo that has become very popular, grown in Toronto. And callaloo from the family of amaranth, it actually have a variety that grows from Canada. So you have the Jamaican variety that's most popular, and then you have the Canadian variety, but you have the Greek variety, you have South Asian variety, lots of variety of kalaloo. But all is country-specific foods that we really cultivate. So when we're talking about Black food sovereignty, and that's the work that we are now engaged with TMU for the last couple of years, is looking at how we could have an agenda to construct a Black Food Sovereignty Alliance in Toronto. And now, right now, we're looking at how we can engage in that governance. And it's a challenges. I know a lot of young folks here are familiar with it, familiar with the work, and I'm honored to be here with Nicole and Hansel and Jane and Adwa. It's a very important work for us to look at collectively. And I know building an alliance is not an easy thing, but that's the challenge that we're up to, because we have to make sure that we look at the tradition. There's a term from Ghana called Sankofa. You have to look back, because we've been here since the 1600s in Canada, and we don't know where to go and find Black farms. We don't know which Black community. So when we talk about loss of land and Indigenous people loss of land, we come here for a long time, and sometimes you want to know if it's ethnic cleansing. That's why it's very important for us to do research on our food histories in this country and to build intentional communities. And we are working to dismantle white supremacy in the food system. And that's the work that we do in making sure we can have systems that can contribute to development. When we talk about the intersection between food and environmental justice, I don't know if you guys are familiar, but the environmental movement is for real upper middle class white folks. And it's like I study environmental studies, and I did a preview, and not even poor white folks are not involved in environmental justice work, in environmental work. And the problem is that with global warming and the whole situation with the environment, it affects all of us. So it should be a movement that involves all peoples and not just one people. And when you want to see white supremacy, you got to go in the environmental movement, where all peoples of colors are left out. But it's an issue that we all need to work on together. So right now, my work, as I said, with TMU is to make sure that we could create an environment, we could have conversations on food sovereignty and look and see how we could move the agenda forward. I know you guys must be familiar with last October, the city of Toronto put out information that they have a Black food sovereignty plan that is being developed and would be championed by people in the Black community. And I think for the work that we've been doing for the last 3 years, there's a great victory. So as of right now, as I said before, it's good to be in this conversation. It's good to see the young folks doing this. I feel so honored and so proud of you guys doing this. Gurneet, much respect.
Thank you so much, Anand, for your amazing words as well. I really enjoyed how you mentioned wanting to dismantle white supremacy in hopes to see Black communities prosper, and collective action is really something really, really important to that. As you mentioned also that Toronto is one of the most diverse places of African diasporas, understanding how to reimagine food sovereignty and food and environmental justice in the multicultural city, one of the most multicultural cities of the world, is so important to that as well. So thank you so much for your insight. And Nicole as well, how does this look like with the work that you do with the Black Food Sovereignty Alliance of Toronto and at Toronto Metropolitan University's Urban Farms?
Your mic, Nicole, mic.
Thank you. I'm going to start from the top because it was important. First of all, I wanted to thank Nardos for doing such a great job, and also wanted to extend my gratitude to the fellow panelists. I've learned so much and I'm so inspired and uplifted, as always, from the things I learn and hear from people like you. And so for me, I just wanted to focus in on, you know, some of the things that resonated with me, things like some of the hunger in the community versus, you know, what we know and what we want to transform and be more food secure and food sovereign. And I think it's really important to always remember there's nothing for us without us. You know, it seems so simple, but I think that this is a really good motto as we gain strength and move forward together. And so I think that it's really important to remember this is truly a transformative journey. And kind of like what Anand was referring to, but it's a journey from, yeah, okay, food insecurity and people looking after us, but to our own food security and transforming systems so we have that, but then really transforming it into food sovereignty. And that's where we really you know, shape our food system for us. And this is something I always like to really acknowledge and honor, that Anand and other elders like Winston, who he mentioned and whatnot, really teaches us and gives us our foundation. But I also think it's important, you know, it's not, it's harsh. You know, food insecurity is grounded in economic inequity. And so there have long been, you know, truly long, big leaps that are not linear as this work goes forward, and you know, even back in stalls at times. And so this is why it's so important to remember that as hard as the work we do is in both space and time, that there are old, big systemic issues that are designed to ensure our efforts do not work. So for example, you know, the hoarding of assets. Not us, we're not hoarding these assets, but the powers that be hoarding assets, both economically and physical, or pitting one marginalized community against another so that we ourselves do the work to keep one another down and suppressed. And so I think, first of all, a key component for those of us who are championing for our food security and food sovereignty, especially in marginalized communities, is that we advocate for ourselves. I just always say this, we have to advocate for ourselves. And I think what that means is that we learn about ourselves and our history and why we're here where we are today. And so you seek out knowledge and guidance from those before us and our elders. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. I really just want to pause on that, because even for myself, as you learn and get empowered and feel excited about getting involved in self-advocacy, you kind of think that maybe some of the ideas you have are novel, and they are. There may be many novel, wonderful ideas, and that's actually a great key to connect the past and the future. We don't need to reinvent the future. We don't want to squander the past efforts. We want to build on it. And for me, that's been a really important lesson in the work I'm doing. And so I think that how you apply that is, we don't want to just, you know, learn about, you know, the past, but we want to transform the future, food policy future, environmental policy future, climate justice policy future at that policy level. Because you can do your not-for-profit community work, which is the foundation of it. But to me, the vision is that we are going to build our capacity and build our knowledge mobilization so that we can truly transform these systems at that policy level, because that's where the true power in this culture and dynamic that we are lies. And we can do it. We have that capacity. So it's about knowledge and building on that knowledge. And so I also think that whether we're Black, Indigenous, or other people of color, and I pause on that because I personally take the time to say that full acronym, because we each have a very important perspective and unique set of ideas that matter and are really powerful and important to really apply and transform our food systems for real, not just as an idea, but in a combination of knowledge and self-advocacy. And so I think the reflex is that we are all classed together, but you have to remember this is actually just another tool that the powers that be class us all together so that they can diminish each of our unique, diverse perspectives, our knowledge, our strengths, our history, our vision, so that they can sort of pit us against one another and sort of dilute it. So of course, I understand that a term like BIPOC, it helps us communicate quickly. We all know what we mean, but I don't know, just my gut tells me that it can dilute our efforts and our unique challenges and perspectives. And then if we can overcome it and capture that strength again for ourselves, that we can really build on that power together. Not just as a sub-community, but together in self-advocacy and activism. And so, going back to the work that I'm doing, if we're looking at, say, organic farming demographics, predominantly in the past, at least in North America, it's been predominantly white, and even very dominated by white females. And that's not to say that the work that they've done isn't important or that they're not allies in this work. However, it has inherently and likely unintentionally manifested exclusionary food and land practices, which is why the work that I'm doing at, now I have to say the whole thing, the Toronto Metropolitan University Urban Farm, is to really make space. And not because that farm, a quarter-acre farm, is going to solve food security, but because it can be a conduit for this knowledge mobilization and a place for people to come, be inspired and be empowered to then lend their voices and efforts for this transformation on both policy and community healing. And so just in summary, because I know we've been here together for a while, and I really appreciate everyone's time and patience. But I think, for those of us who are trying to, especially marginalized communities, to really transform spaces, you always have to remember they're built on colonial systems, but it doesn't mean it has to be the status quo or that it's always going to be and stuck in time. It's going to be up to us. And I feel really hopeful and optimistic being in spaces like this, not naive. It's not easy, but I just think that it's important to understand where we're coming from so we can build the foundation so that we can move on from these truths in a general sense, but also emphasize, that you research your history. It's so important to study local legislation and bylaws so you know the spaces that you're maneuvering in. And your elders and other people before you can give you that. But if I can just stress the message of self-advocacy and self-determination, get into this for yourself. This is one of the transformative things, aside from my elders, that I have done to really feel confident in this work, even though it's constantly evolving. I'm constantly learning. Learn about your local legislation and bylaws so that you know the political environment and the local bylaws and whatnot to really empower yourself to transform your communities in the way you want them to be. Because I can't emphasize enough that I think the key for all of us is self-advocacy, both for you as an individual, but most importantly for the community and the community that you serve. Like I always like to say, I'm not doing this for me. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for our community so that we can transform it and to a better version of what it is now, and not in a naive, rosy sense, but real transformation. Because I think that the foundation that will sustain all of us as we forge our path, make space, is knowledge mobilization, building capacity, so that we can create and transform the communities we want to live in. So with that, thank you once again to our hosts and my fellow panelists. I look forward to connecting with people, and you're welcome to get in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nicole. A lot of empowering and amazing words that you just said. Especially one thing that stuck with me was food insecurity and being embedded in economic inequity. So the way pitting communities against each other that our institutions tend to do is like this divide and conquer technique, which like often and obviously breaks down communities. And I think it's beautiful the way you talk about seeking essential knowledge that pertains to our history to support us in advocacy, and the Urban Farm is doing amazingly at this as well. Neoliberal power is absolutely real, and understanding this is very important. But these knowledges that you mentioned continue to be essential in challenging these capitalistic systems, and political knowledge is as well very, very important, like you said as well. So thank you so much for that. We're running a bit out of time, but we have a quick second question. So thank you so much for the panelists for giving us an introduction of the things that you are doing in pertaining to the first question. So this question more so undergoes how action can come to address these multitude of issues. So we want to ask panelists where and how can we take meaningful action to address the disproportionate impacts of food injustice and environmental racism impacting BIPOC communities in present day Canada. We wanted to leave this open for panelists to chime in. So if anyone would like to go first or jump in, please feel free to at any time. But please do also keep it to around 3 minutes because we are running out of time as well.
Excuse me, I can go first. I think that this question makes me think a lot of a term, excuse me, Adrienne Maree Brown coined as fractal magic. You know, I think especially at the end or within the pandemic, realizing just like how many things on earth are honestly on fire. It's important to understand that we actually are still just bodies with like two hands, and getting as like hyper local as possible, you know, especially for many of us who I am like of a child of immigrants living on a land that's not necessarily the one of my ancestors. For me to really be able to understand how food injustice and environmental justice ties in, I have to start with where I'm at, and I have to start with the people that are around me, and I have to start with what I have. And so that is, I feel, and like the whole notion of fractal magic is many people doing one little thing very, very well, and that kind of creating a web into which multiple people then are advocating for themselves and being a part of and learning and growing this movement, so that it's not just one figurehead that then speaks for the masses, but it's multiple people and their perspectives and their histories, creating a web of what sovereign food systems look like for peoples of many different backgrounds within this land. So I think I'll stop there just so we can keep a part of time. But yeah, just like what we can do with what we have really is, I don't know, has what's been pushing me at least.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Does any other panelists like to go, or? Oh,
I just like to say quickly, because I know it's a time. From my experience over 26 years, we need to demand race-based statistics, because you don't know where you are at if you're not evaluating the state of your food insecurity. And for people of African descent, the same as the indigenous community, we are very food insecure in this country with all its wealth. You imagine over a third of Black children in this country are food insecure. We're talking about over 100-something thousand children growing up food insecure. So we need race-based statistics. We also need to look at assessing organizational racism. With all respect to my white colleagues, for us to have a third of Black children food insecure, you're not doing a good job running these organizations, getting all these big budgets, paying yourself all these big salaries, and you're not doing a good job for our community. That's why we're asking for Black food sovereignty, and we have to do it ourselves. We just need the resources, and we can do a very much better job than that. Over 100,000 Black children. We have little over 1 million Black folks in this country. A third of Black children are food insecure.
Thank you so much, Anand. We also have a question from one of the audience members. Someone asked, how do you see the presence of food deserts in our communities and spaces connect with the topics of culture and race? So feel free for anyone to jump at that.
Sorry, I was reading comments. You might want to say that again. I'm so sorry.
No, absolutely. Give me 1 second. Yeah, how do you see the presence of food deserts in our communities and spaces connect with the topics of culture and race?
I can jump in real quick. I think one of the notions is that we have to understand that food deserts are deliberate. Like it's very actually specifically tied to culture and race. It's specifically tied to where communities migrate when they come into even on into Canada, when people from different countries come into Canada, and the places that they end up congregating, whether it be by access of rent or whether there's familiarity because of other community members. Like food deserts are entirely deliberate and very much also kind of fall on that praxis too of like socioeconomic like stability and race, right? So like I went to school in Waterloo, which is quote unquote a university town and this place where there is a lot of affluence, but that in that same breath, I'd gone to a Walmart within the city where much more of the locals who also are immigrants, there was at a grocery stores that like had literally no fresh food produce section. And I graduated in 2017, right? And so this was like mid 2010s. And so even within our present days, there are still ways that food is being deliberately cut off from certain individuals, either being made by like transportation being too hard, access and like terms of money being too much, and really like the affordability and just the ease of getting this food makes it so it really takes away, like people just don't want to do it. So that would be a connection I'd see for sure.
Can I jump in and just say that even Indigenous people traditional to the lands often don't really like the term food deserts because you may not see, I guess it depends if it's a Western definition of food desert, that we often know where to go on the land for food and that there are specific areas that we can get. We know where to go, we know when to harvest and things like that. So a food desert may not necessarily be just that of the Western definition, even though it may look like there's nothing there, but we see roots and we see trees and we see leaves and we see things that we can gather, harvest and things like that. But I just wanted to add that as an alternate definition.
I was also, when Adwa was talking, I would agree, especially when you may not have that Indigenous knowledge of the land we're in, because for Black people, we're stolen people on stolen land. But Amy, what you said, absolutely. I've been learning this from some of my Indigenous brothers and sisters, and it's inspiring and hopeful as land reclamation happens. But one of the things, and this isn't what's happening now, but I think maybe you guys might have caught so far, I kind of in a little bit of that glass is half full person. So I like to think, okay, we know the state that we're in now, but we do have the power to transform. And so what is the vision we want to see for our future? And at least for this space I'm taking up now with being on a rooftop farm, it's blown my mind. I've never been on a farm in my life. I only started at the farm in January 2021, but it's been like sparking my mind for what could be, because we know that, yeah, okay, the bylaw for a green roof or for green roofs is that any building over 6 feet needs to have some green roof technology. However, the literature and research also shows that when you actually make it an intensive green roof, which is something like farming where it's ecologically diverse and whatnot, it actually is it actually does better with serving climate mitigation, environmental mitigation. When you think about it, most marginalized communities in North America, especially Toronto, are high-rise concrete jungles. What an untapped potential. I'm not saying it's all roses and it's going to solve it all, but I just jumped in on the idea of a food desert. Again, going back to how we want to envision the future we make for ourselves is, I think it's an opportunity. I think it's an opportunity. And so that's why we have to understand the bylaws, and it's not going to happen overnight, but I think it's an opportunity. Thank you.
I think a lot of people have mentioned lots of amazing things, and I would just also say on top of it all that when we talk about meaningful action and kind of directing it to people in positions of power, like what Anand said, people are getting paid lots of money. They're way high on the sunshine list, and there's many people holding lots of positions of power. But you look at the organization, and a lot of these organizations are non-for-profits, and you look at the work they're doing, there is no tangible action within, there's no tangible like reflection of the work in community. And I think it's important for people to give up resources, people in positions of power to give up resources, redirect resources to the people who are actually doing the work, the people on the ground, the people doing grassroots work. And also just acknowledging that like all the work that's done on the grassroots, land back is environmental justice, because when you give the land back, it means like when we practice, follow indigenous practices of the land, it's protecting the land, it's protecting the environment. So that is environmental justice. When we talk about, Black food sovereignty and the practices we have to do to achieve that, that is part of environmental justice. So to do that, just give the resources to the people who are actually doing the work. It's honestly that simple. Just give it up.
With all due respect, Hansel, they're not going to give it up like that. And the other thing about it is that we need at least to research assessing organizational racism. I think when you have information, credible information, because we all could see it, but white folks cannot see it for some reason. So they're not going to give it up. So I think a useful way is to assess these organizations and see who's making decisions, what area, who controlling the finances, and make things up. Like you talk about salaries. I know some folks getting over $150,000 a year. And I could tell people honestly, I've done this for over 27 years, and most times I don't even get $50,000 a year, most times. So, and these folks who getting these $150,000, I know them. And I just wonder, well, what they're really doing for food security. So it's very important for us to assess these organizations and organizational racism. Look at the institutions and question what they do with the money, even question the funders, who they're funding, what are the outputs in relation. As I said, for sure, I don't like the idea that a third of Black children are food insecure. I don't like that.
Would any of the other panelists like to chime in? Or
Yes.
Yeah.
Could I? Yes, well, I would like to summarize and what Nicole and Anne have expressed, and the same Hansel. And it goes also with one question: how to involve universities to work with community groups. Well, universities, for example, my university is working with communities. We work in community development, as Nicole said, we work on transformation. And we have to know that in order to transform food systems and to influence policy making, to change policies, we have to engage in research and to produce not only, well, it is very important to produce quantitative information, but also qualitative information. I have done a literature review of resilient systems with a group of students. And we found that resilient systems are based in indigenous knowledge. And these are not in peer reviews articles. Most of the information and case studies, what we found, are in forms of articles, informal articles, Facebook, and it is also how we interpret our knowledge and how we transmit that knowledge to different audiences. And it is linked to change and transformation. Transformation is difficult, it's painful, but we have to achieve it. And what is the core center of transformation is learning, but learning to change behaviors, to change mental models, to change attitudes. And we can do that. We have tools. You have been doing it. It is also thinking about some terms, as Nicole mentioned. We are used to use buzzwords all the time. And sometimes these terms don't have translation to original languages. And we have to be careful what we say and how we say things if we want to achieve real change and transformation.
Thank you so much to Sylvia and all the panelists who chimed in during this amazing discussion. But it seems as though we have reached the end of the panel and time. I'll give time. Okay, perfect. So thank you again so much to our panelists who have brought their amazing experiences, knowledges, and insights to this panel tonight, and attendees for attending tonight and taking time possibly out of your busy schedules to make it tonight. Again, these knowledges are incredibly valuable to the discourse on food insecurity and environmental racism, and how localized and community action is so incredibly powerful in achieving sovereignty all around and beyond. So thank you again. We will be sharing the recording and a follow-up survey. I believe that there is also already a link to the survey in the chat box, but it will also be emailed to you later. So please do look out for that email, as we'd love to get your feedback on any future events that we do. And thank you once again to our sponsor, York Innovation, on top of the E Initiative and York Region's Youth Food Committee organizers for making this event happen today. Again, oh, perfect, 8:45. We have again reached the end of the time, but I hope everyone has an amazing night and possibly took away some amazing insights from our panelists tonight. So thank you so much, and everyone have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. Nicole, we will be